The late winter wind slipped through the town of Briar Hollow like an old wandering spirit, brushing loose snow across the muddy street and rattling the faded signs that hung above the storefronts. Chimneys breathed thin gray smoke, rising slowly into a pale morning sky as though the heavens themselves were waking reluctantly. Folks moved about bundled in coats patched one too many times, boots crunching against frozen earth, eyes half-lidded from another night of cold. It was a season that showed no mercy to the lonely, the aging, or the unseen, and Eleanor Whitcomb had lived long enough to understand that winter rarely softened for a woman like her. She came walking from the boarding house carrying a small parcel of mended linens, the wool shawl around her shoulders fluttering in the wind like a tired flag. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned neatly, though the breeze kept tugging loose strands against her cheek. She held herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent years keeping her heart steady even when the world refused to do the same. Folks greeted her politely, nodding in a way that felt more like habit than genuine warmth. Eleanor returned each nod with gentle steadiness. She had learned long ago that kindness needed no audience. At the general store entrance, a few settlers gathered around crates of dried beans and winter apples, trading stories about frozen wells and stubborn horses. The talk was light at first, but the mood shifted when Eleanor stepped closer. Among them was Caleb Mercer, a man younger than her by only a handful of years, though he clung to youth as though it might slip away if he loosened his grip. His coat was worn, his pride thinner still, and winter had not been gentle to his ranch. He looked Eleanor up and down with the familiar mixture of amusement and bitterness that had followed her for years. "You're still carrying those orders for folks, Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice drifting into the open air without the shelter of courtesy. "Near 50 winters, and you still busying your hands for families that ain't yours. A shame a woman spends her days alone sewing instead of settling down like proper people do." A few people chuckled softly, not out of cruelty but from that uncomfortable instinct to join the safer side of a moment. Eleanor felt the weight of their glances settle along her shoulders, heavier than the parcel she held. She did not flinch. Instead, she looked at Caleb the same way she looked at a frayed hem, something that could be mended if someone took the time, though not every garment was worth repairing. "Some of us serve where we are needed," she murmured, her voice soft as thawing ice. "And that is enough." Her words drifted through the air and dissolved like breath in winter. Caleb scoffed, but the others looked away, ashamed or simply eager to move on. Eleanor stepped inside the store, letting the familiar scent of pine wood and lamp oil wrap around her like a warmer coat than anything she owned. She handed the linens to Mrs. Holloway, received a loaf of hard bread in payment, and left quietly. Outside, the world felt wider and colder all at once. Snow flurries danced in slow circles around her boots, lifting briefly before falling again, as though even the weather couldn't decide where it belonged. Across the street, Samuel Crowley loaded sacks of grain onto his wagon. The most respected rancher in the valley, a man carved of weathered strength and long silences. He paused as Eleanor passed, his gloved hands lingering on the rope he was tying. He had seen the small scene with Caleb, and though he said nothing, his gaze carried a steadiness that touched her spirit more than any spoken defense. "Morning, Miss Whitcomb," he said in a tone both quiet and warm, as though he were not speaking to the woman mocked in the street but to someone he already respected. "Fine day, if winter allows it." Eleanor offered a faint smile. "Fine enough." Their exchange lasted no more than a few heartbeats, yet something in the moment softened a corner of her chest she had forgotten could soften at all. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment, no hurried politeness meant to distance himself from her embarrassment. Only a calm acknowledgment, as if he had been watching her far longer than she realized. She walked on, bread tucked beneath her arm, trying to ignore the ache that followed her steps. Not the ache of humiliation, that had long ago grown dull, but the ache of being reminded that unseen kindness still existed in the world. She had never asked for tenderness, never expected it. But in Samuel's brief gaze, she sensed the rare feeling of being truly observed, not for what she lacked, but for who she was. At the edge of town, young Thomas Reed waved at her from the stable door, straw clinging to his coat. He lived alone behind the livery, scraping by since his father's passing. Eleanor often mended his shirts without charge, and he repaid her with pumpkin seeds or stories about mustangs he hoped to train one day. "Miss Eleanor, wind's picking up," he called. "Roads will freeze by sundown." "Thank you, Thomas. Keep warm if you can." He grinned, tipping an imaginary hat. "I will if the woodpile lasts." Eleanor wished she had more coin to help him, but she only nodded and continued toward the boarding house. The afternoon sun sank behind gray clouds, casting long shadows across the street. She could feel the chill tightening around her hands and quickened her steps. Just as she reached the gate, a sudden gust of wind lifted her shawl and pulled her back toward the road. She steadied herself but paused when she saw Samuel still standing beside his wagon. He was watching her again, unintentionally perhaps, but the look on his face carried something weightier than chance. He turned as though to speak, then stopped himself. Instead, he climbed onto the wagon and guided his horses forward, leaving her with an unspoken question lingering in the air between them. Eleanor stepped inside the boarding-house doorway, her breath slow, her heart slower still. The scent of stew drifted from the kitchen, but she did not move toward it. She remained there a moment, hand resting on the wooden frame, listening to the distant creak of wagon wheels disappearing down the road. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest tremor of something she barely recognized: anticipation. But winter had one more whisper for her. Outside, Caleb Mercer watched from the corner of the alley. His eyes narrowed with something sharper than mockery. Something that promised trouble when the thaw came. And Eleanor, unaware of the shadow forming behind her, stepped deeper into the warm room, carrying with her the quiet certainty that her life, steady as stitched fabric, had just felt its first loose thread. The days that followed settled over Briar Hollow like a thin veil of frost, delicate yet persistent, clinging to every rooftop and heart. Eleanor moved through her routines with practiced quiet, though something inside her had begun to shift. The small moment with Samuel Crowley lingered in her thoughts like a warm ember refusing to die, its faint glow keeping the cold from fully claiming her spirit. She stitched shirts, brewed teas for the sick, and balanced ledgers at the boarding-house table, yet that calm recognition in Samuel's gaze remained, rising to the surface whenever she least expected it. The town itself lived on whispers, especially in slow seasons when the wind carried more stories than news. Clara Mayfield, bright-eyed and restless from winter's confinement, stood outside the mercantile one morning with two other women, their shawls rustling as they leaned in close. Eleanor didn't mean to linger near them, yet fate placed her there as she waited for a wagon to pass. Clara's voice drifted through the air, soft at first, then sharpened by curiosity. "I heard Samuel Crowley looked at her as though she were spring itself," Clara murmured, tapping her chin. "Imagine that. A man like him noticing a woman who chose to age right in front of us rather than marry anyone who'd take her." The other women exchanged glances, half curious, half amused. They weren't cruel, not deliberately, but their words carried the sting of disbelief. The town had long agreed, quietly, subtly, and without challenge, that Eleanor Whitcomb belonged to a corner of life where love did not wander. Eleanor pretended not to hear them, though a tightening formed beneath her ribs. She stepped inside the mercantile, breathed in the familiar scent of pine dust and burlap, and kept her composure steady as she purchased herbs and thread. But the whisper clung to her shawl like burrs, refusing to let go. Outside, she crossed paths with Thomas Reed, who hurried toward her with a bundle of firewood balanced on his shoulder. His breath fogged the air, cheeks pink from cold. "Miss Eleanor, I saved the last of the good pieces for you," he said proudly. "Figured you might need them more than the saloon does." Eleanor smiled despite the heaviness inside her. "Thank you, Thomas. That's very thoughtful." He grinned, and in that grin lived the pure simplicity of gratitude, a warmth she found rare among adults. He offered to carry the bundle to the boarding-house, but she declined gently, reminding him to keep enough strength to chop more before sundown. Their exchange eased something knotted inside her, yet it did not erase what she'd overheard. Words had a way of lingering long after they were spoken. As she headed back through the street, the rhythmic sound of hooves reached her ears. Samuel's wagon turned the corner, moving at an easy pace. He slowed as he drew near, tipping his hat in that understated way that made her feel acknowledged without being put on display. "Morning again, Miss Whitcomb. Need a ride? Road's icy." His voice held no pressure, only calm invitation. Eleanor hesitated, sensing the eyes of Clara and others hovering nearby. Accepting kindness in public was never simple for a woman who had lived half her life ignored and the other half misjudged. Still, she stepped toward the wagon. "If you're already headed that way," she said softly. Always room for you, he replied, as though the words came naturally to him. She climbed up carefully, the wooden seat creaking beneath her. Samuel guided the horses forward, their breath rising like slow clouds in the morning chill. The ride was quiet, but not the kind of silence that weighs heavy. It was the quiet of two people accustomed to holding their thoughts with care. Eleanor glanced at Samuel's hands, strong, steady, marked by the labor of winters past. He drove with ease, eyes shifting between the road and the world around them. She wondered how many things he noticed that others overlooked. He had the air of a man who saw life not in loud flashes but in small, revealing details. He spoke without turning his head. Heard there was some trouble outside the store the other day. Folks talking when they shouldn't. Her breath paused. She had hoped the moment with Caleb would fade unseen into the snow. People talk when winter keeps them idle, she replied. It's nothing new. Samuel nodded, though his brow tightened. You deserve better than careless words, Eleanor. The simplicity of his statement struck deeper than the insult itself had. She looked away, letting the cold air cool the warmth rising in her cheeks. They reached the boarding house sooner than she wished. Samuel pulled the reins, and the horses slowed to a gentle halt. Eleanor climbed down, feeling the weight of Clara's whispers still clinging to the back of her mind. Yet Samuel's presence had shifted something, like a lantern lit in a darkened room, offering no promises yet refusing to be extinguished. Thank you, Samuel, she said, her voice steady. Any time, he answered. His eyes lingered on her a moment longer, not with longing or claim, but with recognition, genuine, unhurried, unmistakable. As his wagon pulled away, the boarding-house door opened behind her. Mrs. Holloway studied Eleanor with a knowing expression, her apron dusted with flour. You look as though winter gave you something to think about, she said affectionately. Come inside. Stew's simmering. Eleanor stepped in, letting the familiar warmth fold around her. She busied herself with the herbs, chopping them slowly, grounding her thoughts in small motions. The murmur of voices outside drifted faintly through the window, whispers she could not hold back, nor stop, nor fully ignore. Yet beneath those whispers lived another truth, one she dared not name. She had felt seen today. Not pitied, not judged, seen. And that recognition, small as it was, stirred a quiet fear. Not of ridicule, but of hope, the most fragile thing she possessed. Night settled early, draping the town in silver-blue darkness. Eleanor sat by her small window, candle flickering beside her, watching Samuel's wagon pass in the distance as he headed toward his ranch. The shape of him in the lantern light was barely visible, yet she recognized the silhouette as though it belonged to a memory she hadn't made yet. She did not know he paused at the edge of the road, looking back at the faint glow of her window before urging his horses onward. And she did not see Caleb Mercer standing by the stables, jaw clenched, watching the same wagon with a darkness settling behind his eyes, something colder than winter wind, and far more dangerous. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as though reluctant to release Briar Hollow from its cold stewardship. The snow no longer fell in heavy sheets but drifted lightly, softening into slush beneath the morning sun. Eleanor Whitcomb noticed the change first in the way the air tasted, less sharp, more forgiving, and in how the birds returned to the eaves with cautious songs. Each small shift reminded her that seasons could change even when hearts did not yet know how. She spent her mornings tending to small tasks in the boarding-house kitchen, the scent of boiling oats filling the narrow rooms. But today, Mrs. Holloway rushed in with cheeks flushed from the cold and urgency in her steps. "Thomas Reed's taken sick," she said breathlessly. "Fever. He's shivering like he's swallowed winter whole." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She gathered her satchel of herbs, pulled her shawl tighter around her frame, and stepped into the chilly air. The slush made soft sounds beneath her boots as she hurried toward the stable where Thomas lived. A lantern flickered inside, casting weak light over the boy curled in a blanket on a bed of straw. His breaths came shallow and quick. Eleanor knelt beside him, brushing damp hair from his brow. "Hush now, child. I'm here." Thomas tried to speak, but his voice cracked like dry wood. She brewed willow bark tea in a dented tin cup, coaxing him to sip. She laid warm cloths across his forehead, her fingers steady even as her heart tightened. The fever was dangerous, but she had seen worse. Still, she knew she could not tend him alone. He needed warmth, a safer place to rest, and another set of hands. A heavy knock echoed through the stable door. Eleanor turned to see Samuel Crowley standing in the cold, snow clinging to his coat and beard. "Mrs. Holloway told me what happened," he said. "Thought you might need help." Relief swept through her like unexpected warmth. Together, they lifted Thomas gently, wrapping him in Samuel's thick riding blanket. The boy whimpered, pressing himself closer to Eleanor. Samuel guided them toward his wagon, clearing a space near the front. "Bring him to my ranch," Samuel said. "Warmer there. Fire burns hotter, and there's room. No sense leaving him to freeze in this place." Eleanor hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. She climbed into the wagon, holding Thomas close as Samuel snapped the reins. The horses surged forward, hooves striking the icy road with sure confidence. The wind brushed her face, but she hardly felt it. Instead, she watched Samuel. How he kept glancing at Thomas, how his jaw tightened with concern, how the lines around his eyes deepened when he stole small glances at her. At the ranch, Samuel carried Thomas inside, laying him near the hearth. The cabin smelled of cedar and winter smoke, a comfort Eleanor had almost forgotten. She knelt beside Thomas again, tending his fever with focused care. Samuel stoked the fire until its orange glow brightened the room, warming the boy's shivering form. Hours passed in a quiet rhythm, Eleanor brewing herbs, Samuel bringing warm water, the two exchanging brief looks that contained more meaning than words could hold. As the fever broke at last, Thomas drifted into a restful sleep, his breath slow and steady. Eleanor sank into a chair, exhaustion softening her posture. Samuel set a cup of tea in front of her. "You saved him," he said softly. She shook her head. "He saved himself. I only helped him along." Samuel watched her hands wrap around the cup, the steam rising into her face. "You always make less of yourself than the world does, Eleanor. I've never understood why." His words pierced her carefully built armor. She stared into the tea, watching the amber liquid tremble. "When people look at me, they see someone past her prime. Someone who stayed too long in her own life. Who didn't catch the road in time," she said. "I learned to hold quiet places inside me. It's easier than expecting anything more." Samuel leaned against the hearth, the glow of the fire outlining his silhouette. "Maybe the world saw you wrong. Maybe it needed older eyes to see right." The room felt too warm suddenly, her breath catching in the weight of his sincerity. She didn't know how to answer, so she watched the flames instead, letting their gentle flicker steady her heart. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, turning the snow into a field of quiet blue. The ranch seemed to breathe with its own life, each board creaking softly in the cooling air. Samuel offered her a place to rest, insisting she was too tired to return. She agreed reluctantly, settling into his late wife's old rocking chair with a blanket draped across her lap. Samuel sat across from her, whittling a piece of wood. The rhythmic scrape of his knife blended with the crackle of the fire. For the first time, Eleanor saw not the admired rancher, but a lonely man carrying years of silent longing. His solitude mirrored hers so closely it made her chest ache. When Thomas stirred in his sleep, Samuel rose to check on him. Eleanor followed. Together they stood by the boy's side, their shoulders nearly touching. Their closeness was unintentional, natural, like two branches leaning toward the same sunlight. Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're good with him. You're good with everyone, Eleanor. Even those who don't deserve it." She exhaled softly. "Kindness is the only thing I can give freely." He turned to her then, eyes lingering with an earnestness that made her pulse quicken. "You give more than you know. You steady this town in ways they've never thanked you for." "No one has spoken to me like that in years," she admitted, the words slipping through her defenses before she could stop them. He nodded slowly. "Folks forget that strength doesn't always come with noise." Her gaze lowered, focusing on the floorboards worn smooth by years of footsteps. "What do you see when you look at me, Samuel?" He hesitated, long enough for her breath to still. Then he answered, every word unhurried. "I see a woman who survived a life that could have broken her. A woman who keeps choosing gentleness even when the world gives her reasons not to. A woman worth noticing. Her throat tightened. The question she carried felt fragile, dangerous. Why say such things to me? His eyes softened. Because they're true. And because you deserve to hear them from someone who means them. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across her face. She looked away, unable to hide the tremor in her chest. She felt seen in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in decades. A knock suddenly broke through the stillness. Sharp, urgent, rattling the wooden door. Samuel stiffened. No one visits this late. Another knock echoed, louder. Eleanor's stomach tightened with unease. Samuel crossed the room and opened the door. Cold air surged in, bringing with it the last voice she wanted to hear. Caleb Mercer stood on the porch, face twisted by something darker than mockery this time. His eyes flicked from Samuel to Eleanor, then to the sleeping boy behind them. "So this is where you've been," he muttered, a bitter edge in his tone. "Whole town's talking. Didn't take long for folks to wonder what a woman your age needs from a man like him." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, the fragile warmth she'd carried splintering under the weight of his accusation. And Samuel, seeing the hurt flicker across her face, stepped forward, not with anger, but with a resolve that promised this moment would change everything. Samuel didn't raise his voice, didn't square his shoulders, didn't offer the spectacle Caleb seemed hungry for. Instead, he stepped just far enough forward to make the air between them shift. The firelight behind him threw half his face into a warm glow, leaving the other half shadowed, calm but impossible to misread. Eleanor felt the change like a tremor beneath her feet. Quiet, steady, unavoidable. "You chose the wrong evening to bring trouble to my doorstep, Caleb," Samuel said. His tone even, almost gentle. But for the first time, gentle carried weight. Caleb's eyes flicked past Samuel, landing on Eleanor with a bitterness sharpened by years of unmet want and self-inflicted wounds. He'd always blamed the world for overlooking him, never noticed how his own pride turned every good thing away. Now he looked at Eleanor as though she were responsible for something she had never taken from him. "I'm not bringing trouble," he muttered. "I'm bringing truth." Town's whispering. Samuel. Whispering that you, of all men, brought her out here for reasons folks shouldn't have to guess at. Eleanor's breath caught. Shame flashed like lightning beneath her ribs, not because of what Caleb accused her of, but because she had lived half her life expecting to be humiliated by someone exactly like him. The past had trained her well. She felt herself retreating, folding inward, as though the mere sound of mockery could undo decades of quiet resilience. Samuel saw it. He stepped slightly to the side, not shielding her, but standing beside her in a way that made the air feel less hostile. "The whispers in Briar Hollow aren't your concern," Samuel said. "And Eleanor owes no explanation to you or anyone else." Caleb scoffed, snow crunching under his boots as he shifted his weight. "That's so. Because it seems to me she's making a fool of you both. A woman past 50 catching rides in your wagon, hiding in your cabin like she belongs here. What else do you call it? Belongs here." The word struck Eleanor harder than the insult that followed. For a fleeting second, she wondered, terrified and hopeful, what if she did? Samuel's expression didn't change, but something in him hardened like cooling iron. "You think belonging ends at 30? You think kindness has an age limit?" His voice stayed soft, but the softness cut sharper than shouting. Caleb opened his mouth, but Samuel didn't give him time. "I've watched you mock her for months," Samuel continued. "Maybe years. I've watched you shrink yourself by making her small. And I won't have you bringing that poison here. Leave, Caleb. Tonight." Thomas stirred behind them, coughing weakly. The sound seemed to cut through the tension like a blade. Caleb's gaze shifted to the boy, confusion flickering in his expression. Confusion, then disdain. "So she's tending strays now too," he muttered. "How noble." Before Eleanor could speak, Samuel stepped out onto the porch fully, closing some invisible distance between them. His voice lowered. "One more insult, Caleb. Just one." The quiet in his tone made Caleb step back, not out of respect, but instinct. Eleanor placed a trembling hand on the doorframe. She hadn't asked for Samuel's defense. She didn't want anyone harmed on her behalf. But she couldn't deny the truth blooming painfully inside her. No one had ever stood for her like this. Not once in all her years. Caleb spat into the snow. This ain't over. She can't outrun what people think. And neither can you. He turned, crunching through the snow until the dark swallowed him whole. The cold rushed in behind him, and Samuel closed the door slowly, as though sealing a chapter neither of them had been ready to face. Inside, the fire crackled, unaware of the storm that still hummed in the air. Eleanor's hand hovered near her shawl, its edges trembling faintly. Samuel looked at her, waiting, patient, steady, as though giving her space to speak or remain silent. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. He tilted his head. "Which part?" "Any of it. He'll make things worse. He'll twist your kindness into something ugly. He always has." Samuel walked toward the chairs near the hearth, motioning for her to sit. "Caleb's voice can't ruin what's true, Eleanor. It only echoes what's false inside himself." She lowered herself into the rocking chair, fingers tightening around its curved arms. "I've lived long enough to know that some echoes grow louder than truth." Samuel crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of the fire against his sleeve. "Do you believe anything he said tonight?" She swallowed. "Not about you. And about yourself?" Her throat closed. Years of silence pressed against her chest, old wounds resurfacing like ghosts drawn to lamplight. "I don't know what I believe about myself anymore," she admitted. "The world decided I was done before I ever felt finished. I've moved through rooms like a shadow, grateful just to be allowed to stay." Samuel's eyes softened. "You're not a shadow, Eleanor." Her gaze drifted to Thomas, sleeping soundly now beneath a thick quilt. The boy's breath rose and fell gently, as if warmed by hope instead of fire. "I've built a life around being useful," she whispered. "Not chosen." Samuel didn't answer immediately. He looked at her hands, steady, capable, worn by years of healing and holding and helping. He saw in them what the town refused to: endurance, gentleness, strength. "Being chosen is not the measure of a life," he said finally. "Being true is." Her eyes stung. She looked at the fire to steady herself, afraid to drown in the tenderness of his words. The ranch was quiet around them, the night holding its breath. Outside, the wind brushed snow against the cabin walls, but it felt softer now, like a lullaby instead of a warning. Samuel stood slowly. "You should sleep. The storm's easing, but the road won't be safe until morning. Take my room. I'll keep watch by the fire." Eleanor shook her head. "No, Samuel. I can't take your bed. And I can't stay here another night after the way Caleb saw us. The gossip will swallow us whole." "Then let it," Samuel said, his voice low and unwavering. "Let the town talk. But don't you dare shrink yourself because someone small spoke loudly." She stared at him, breath caught in her chest. The words were simple, but they felt like hands pulling her from deep water. Samuel walked to the door, pressing his palm against the wood as though steadying himself. "Tomorrow, you and I will walk into town together. Not hiding, not explaining, just living. If the town wants to twist that into something else, let them choke on their own stories." Her heart trembled. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple, Eleanor. We choose what is true, not what is easy." She hadn't expected her name in his mouth to feel like sunlight. Silence settled between them once more, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things nearly spoken, of fears dissolving, of something new taking root in soil long thought barren. Samuel turned toward her fully. "And Eleanor," the way he said it made her lift her eyes, "you don't ever need to hide beside me." Her breath hitched, because in those few words lived every possibility she had never dared imagine. But before she could respond, before she could touch the fragile miracle unfolding in the space between them, a sudden chill swept across the cabin floor. The fire flickered violently. Thomas stirred, mumbling something indistinct. And a shadow passed across the window, slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. Eleanor's pulse quickened as Samuel moved toward the door, his jaw tightening, his hand slipping instinctively toward the rifle propped beside the hearth. Someone was outside, watching, waiting, and Samuel whispered the words that made Eleanor's blood turn cold. It's not the storm. It's him. The wind pressed itself against the cabin walls as though trying to slip inside, carrying with it a sharpened cold that did not belong to weather. Samuel moved with quiet precision, stepping toward the door, his hand closing around the rifle as though it were an extension of his resolve. Eleanor felt her pulse echo in her fingertips, each beat scattering through her like frightened birds. Thomas slept unaware, his small breaths fogging the edges of the quilt. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath with them. Samuel eased the door open just enough to peer into the night. The lantern light spilled onto the porch, catching the outline of a figure standing near the corral, still as a stone, watching. Caleb. His stance was rigid, his shoulders tense with a pride that had curdled into something darker. Snow swirled around him, clinging to his coat, giving him the strange look of a man carved from winter itself. Eleanor stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Caleb, please, this isn't the way." Her voice drifted across the yard like a trembling ribbon of breath. Caleb's head lifted, and even from a distance, she could feel the intensity of his stare. His voice cracked through the night like breaking branches. "I warned you. I warned him. This town don't bend its ways for the likes of you." Samuel lifted the lantern higher, the golden light cutting through the shadows to reveal the strain on Caleb's face. Anger, yes, but beneath it, a deep and desperate loneliness. Eleanor recognized it painfully. She'd carried her own version of that loneliness for decades. But Caleb had let his loneliness fester into blame, into bitterness, into danger. "Leave this ranch," Samuel said, his voice calm, threading through the night with quiet authority. "Before you do something you can't undo." "Undo?" Caleb laughed, a brittle, ragged sound. "You think I'm the one who ruined something? She's the one ruining everything. The town's laughing at me for bothering with her. Laughing because she, at her age, gets taken in like she's something precious." Eleanor flinched. The accusation was cruel not because it was loud, but because it was meant to strike at old wounds she had spent years covering. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, snow crunching beneath his boots. "We aren't here to feed your pride, Caleb. Go home." Caleb's hand moved toward his coat, and time slowed in a sudden, chilling silence. The lantern flame wavered. Eleanor felt her breath shatter. Then Caleb pulled something from his pocket. Not a gun, but a jagged piece of wood, sharpened at the end, trembling violently in his grip. "I won't let you make a fool of me," he hissed, stepping forward. Samuel raised his rifle, not to fire, but to aim, steady and sure. "Caleb, drop it." But Caleb's pride was louder than reason, and he surged forward, snow flying from his boots. Samuel stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between Eleanor and the oncoming danger. The world narrowed to the sound of labored breaths, the crunch of hurried steps, and Eleanor's whispered prayer that this winter night would not end in blood. Caleb lunged, but Samuel sidestepped with controlled precision, grabbing Caleb's wrist and twisting sharply until the makeshift weapon fell into the snow. Caleb cried out, staggering. Samuel shoved him back with enough force to send him sprawling into the slush. The crackling fire inside the cabin echoed the tension rising outside. "Stay down," Samuel said, voice low enough to make the night shudder. But Caleb wasn't listening. He scrambled up again, wild-eyed, hands shaking. "You don't get to take her. You don't get to make me the fool." Eleanor stepped forward, her shawl billowing in the cold wind. She had no weapon, no threat in her body, only a lifetime of understanding pain. "Caleb Mercer, look at yourself. This isn't you. This is fear wearing your face." Her voice, soft, trembling, earnest, slipped through the chaos like a thread of warmth. Caleb froze. For a moment, he looked lost, as if her words cracked through the armor he'd built around himself. His breath shook. Everyone's laughing. You don't know what it's like." Eleanor stepped closer, snow soaking her hem. "I do know. I've lived it longer than you've been alive in spirit. But hurting others won't quiet that ache." Caleb's eyes wavered, uncertainty flickering in the depths. Then Samuel gently lowered his rifle. "Go home, Caleb. Not as an enemy, just a man who needs to start over." The storm inside Caleb finally broke. He dropped to his knees in the snow, the weight of his own anguish pulling him down. When he rose again, he was smaller somehow, deflated. Without another word, he turned into the darkness, disappearing into the swirling flakes. Eleanor stood still, hands shaking, breath thin. Samuel returned to her slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal. "You're safe now," he murmured. But she wasn't thinking of safety. She was thinking of the way Samuel had stepped between her and danger, not as duty, not as show, but as instinct born of something deeper. Inside the cabin, Thomas stirred again, and the world seemed to right itself little by little. Eleanor sank into the rocking chair, exhaling a tremor she'd been holding since the knock on the door earlier that night. Samuel set the rifle aside and knelt before her, eyes searching her face with a tenderness that made her heart flutter painfully. "You shouldn't have had to face that," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever." Eleanor touched the arm of the chair, grounding herself. "I've faced worse alone. But tonight, I wasn't alone." Samuel looked down, his breath steady but uneven. "I meant what I said before Caleb came. About truth. About not hiding." Her heartbeat quickened. Samuel lifted his eyes to hers, and something deep, long buried inside her stirred awake. "Eleanor, I don't want to walk into town beside you because I feel responsible for you. I want to do it because it's where I belong. Beside you. If you'll have me there." Her breath caught. 50 years of silence, of being overlooked, of being dismissed. All of it gathered into a single moment where someone finally saw her not as leftover time, but as living possibility. Tears warmed her lashes. Samuel reached out, not touching her yet, as if asking permission with his eyes. "You don't need youth to be loved. You only need truth. And mine is simple. I see you, Eleanor. All of you." Her tears fell then, not of sorrow, but release. She placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling. And for the first time in decades, she felt chosen not out of pity, but out of reverence. Outside, the wind softened, brushing the eaves like a blessing. The fire burned steady behind them. And as Samuel lifted her hand to his lips, a quiet vow filled the space between them, a vow that winter could not silence, nor gossip undo. But before dawn could break, a distant sound rose from the dark horizon. Hooves. Many of them. Past. Samuel stood, face sharpening with concern. "This time," he whispered, "it's not Caleb." And Eleanor understood. Something far larger than gossip was riding toward them, and this night was not done shaping their fate.